But welcome to the IQ AI Lab Podcast, episode 11. Joined today by Josh Chettiar, our local AI expert at IQbusiness, and Tim Matthis, who's returning this time around as a guest. Tim is pursuing some other interests at the moment, but we'd love to have Tim back and gain his insights around the AI world and community. Today, we want to spend a bit of time covering some of the latest news and developments pretty much across the world, some stuff happening in the US, but generally speaking, what's happening in big tech. There's been a bit of a scare on the stock markets. Initially, everybody was calling it an AI bubble burst. It seems like it's actually got more to do with the Japanese yen carry trade. So fortunately, AI is still going for now. And we want to maybe cover a little bit of what the future is going to look like. So I'm going to jump straight in. I think, Josh, you wanted to share some news around the Olympics. I mean, how's the Olympics got anything to do with AI?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Karl. It's been in the news recently, the use of AI or AI technologies at the Olympics. I guess I'll talk a little bit about Athlete GPT. That's quite an interesting tool that's being used by the athletes at the Olympics, and I think it's actually quite a nice demonstration or use case of what we've talked about on the lab before, and what everyone in the industry is talking about in terms of this thing called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, and large language models, and simply finding more efficient ways to retrieve information conversationally in real time, pertinent information, etc. And what Mistral, some of the listeners rather, you may have heard of Mistral, which is an AI startup, a French AI startup, and of course the Olympics is in France. So they were tasked of building this custom GPT, if you will, called Athlete GPT, and essentially it's aimed to give athletes a 365 around ability to conversationally and in real time ask questions relating to social media guidelines, anti-doping rules, what things from a political and religious point of view they're not allowed to show or not show because of whatever Olympic guidelines there are that exists. And quite interestingly, it's actually powered by Intel's processors. So maybe Intel finding a good opportunity to try and get into the AI market. And obviously, everyone knows NVIDIA is very much the leader here. But Intel, with their what they're calling Gordy processors, a new type of processor they've built. And right now, everyone in the athlete village is using the Olympic athlete village is using this sort of RAG tool to try and get information about what I just mentioned. So that's actually quite an interesting real life use case. And if you think about what we've been talking about, some of the technology being used in practical business applications. So very similar things, being able to, in real time, get information conversationally that in the previous years, one would have to, go through a simple keyword search or a Google search and then read the actual documents. And, so we're talking about this sort of information retrieval acceleration that this technology is bringing. A little bit of a whole low-hanging fruit, one would say. It is more complicated RAG solutions than it seems, but it is a bit of a low-hanging fruit. But great to see that the Olympics, and maybe it will also move on to other sporting organizations as well, with the Olympics setting the trend there. So quite interesting. I'm not sure, Karl, do you have a favorite Olympic sport that you've been following, or wish you had the time to follow?
But if I always take the time to watch as much of the Olympic sports as I can. I think you don't normally see these kinds of sports on TV. So, I'd have to go for fencing. I really enjoyed the combative sports like fencing. It's not something I get to watch every so often, but it was really fun to watch the team sports and the individual, the épée, the foil, the saber. I really like that.
Interesting. I'm a big soccer fan, so I guess the Olympics soccer is something I've been following. Spain recently won the gold medal there. Tim, much on your side, is it something more track and field, or do you follow the?
Well, it wasn't until very recently that my favorite sport was the women's boxing. I'll leave it to those who watched that knockout round to understand why. I took a lot of amusement out of that. And I think the other one which I enjoyed, mostly because I thought it was completely ridiculous, was the 10-meter shooting competition, where everybody lines up and shoots at a target that everyone barely moves in that event, and shoots around a very small target. But no, in all seriousness, I think when we look at the use of AI, something that really strikes me about the progression of the Olympics has been I am a track and field athlete, or athlete. I use that word a little bit generously. But if you look at the men's 100 meters and you look at the Olympic record, I think Bob Haynes 60 years ago set it, and the 100-meter dash was 10.06 seconds. In the 60 years since then, we've built better shoes. People have gone from running on dirt tracks where they used to carve out little holes instead of having starting blocks on their feet, they had little holes in the dirt track when they'd start. We've got all this refinement to nutrition, technology, everything else. And then we've got Usain Bolt, who holds a new record at 9.63 seconds 60 years later. So with all of that technology advancement, we've managed to increase the speed over 100 meters by 0.04 seconds. So I wonder how much these GPTs are really going to make a difference. I look forward to a world where optimists become athletes in the Olympics, and we start to see some of the really cool stuff that's happening with Musk and with Neuralink really bringing next generation cool augmented people into the Olympics. What has been the impact of these Olympic GPTs, Josh? Have we seen performance improvements, or how's it mattered?
Yeah, I guess it's I'm not sure if anyone's actually collecting those metrics, to be honest, at the Olympics, but I'm sure it's helping in some ways. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of it. Haven't seen much myself, so early days, I guess, but I think it should ideally help athletes prepare more efficiently, get more rest, get to where they need to be in time, not break rule violations unconsciously, etc. So I guess those are some of the metrics we would naturally look out for there, but nothing I've seen so far to that effect, at least that's been released. But those, I guess, some of the outputs I would imagine the project's aiming to achieve. I think one artifact, at least from a developer point of view or business point of view, that's interesting, is they've released a paper on how they've built the sort of architecture for this RAG solution, and how they've built in just different guardrails, different models, different failover models. If a specific model fails, maybe for an API call or the rest, they've built in failovers. So I think this whole thing of AI engineering and architecture of these systems are getting much more mature. I mean, when I got into this very early on in the RAG thing, about a year and a half ago, it was very basic with the basic components of embedding, retrieval, etc. And now we're seeing evaluation metrics come up. We've seen things like guardrails come up as part of an architecture to try and constrain models, and failover solutions for other LLMs. We've even seen cost optimization come into play, where depending on the user query, one or more an AI agent may choose to send that LLM that request to LLM A versus B, depending based purely on cost and accuracy, etc. So instead of always sending the same thing to a massive model, it's going to be incurring cost. You can send some requests to small models that are cheaper, others to larger models. So at least there's one. I haven't interrogated that Olympic paper in detail. It's something that I'm glad they've at least released it. It's always great that these techniques and these methods are growing in the industry, etc. But of course, I mean, there's a lot more that's been happening in the industry besides the Olympics and Olympic GPTs. There's a lot in terms of open source models coming out on top of the leaderboards, likes of Llama 3.1 and the rest. Karl, I think you have an interesting framework to sort of unpack or approach this first. Great if you could take us through.
Yeah, sure. And maybe it's the Olympics that inspired it, because I was thinking about the Olympic flame, and interestingly, the next set of Olympics is going to be in LA. I would imagine by then we're going to see some real introduction of AI into the Olympics, not just for preparation of athletes, but potentially the viewership and everything else that's going to happen. So really keen to see what happens. But I was thinking a bit about that flame, and it made me think about the fire triangle. So for those of you that don't know, if you want to have a fire, you have to make sure that you have this fire triangle, which is fire needs oxygen, it needs heat, and it needs fuel. And then it needs that spark, which is really the chemical reaction that creates a fire. Now, if you don't have those elements, those three elements, and I suppose the tetrahedron, which is that spark, it will not burn and it will not sustain itself. And it made me think that in AI, the developments we are seeing and maybe talking about now, Josh, really kind of reflect some of these elements. Number one is you need like three things. You need the models, so we can see lots of work going into model development. On the other side, you need data, and we can see the issues around getting more data, and we can talk a bit about what's going on there. New York Times obviously struck many deals with some of the model developers to supply data. Getting fresh data, fresh quality data is very important. So model is number one, data number two. And then the third thing is we can see that they need processing power. And that means you need chips. And chips are there to obviously go and help build out these models, run the models. And there are so many firms at the moment building new chips. Google is, investing in a new chip. Meta has got a new chip. Now, none of these have their own chip fabs. They're still sitting and fabricating all their chips in Taiwan at TSMC or via Samsung. But they are all designing chips. And why are they designing chips? And I think that's the fourth part, which makes the AI triangle, AI tetrahedron. You need a use case in the middle. And that's the spark. You need it to be useful for something. And I think what's happening is you're seeing many of the big tech players, combining the models, the data, and the chips to find very specific use cases that they want to solve in the most efficient way, because we know AI is hungry. I've read something about the prediction that 20 to 25% of the US electricity production will be used up by AI data centers by the turn of the century. It's not that far away. It's quite a scary thought. So all of a sudden, perhaps the limiting factors to AI might be how much energy a country can produce. What is the next program for building nuclear or sustainable energy down the line? Josh, I mean, how does that fit into some of the developments you've seen out there? I mean, we're speaking about things like Llama 3.1. Meta's obviously made some giant strides forward there in that open source model. What have you seen?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that's a very interesting framework, and I think within that, the model arm of the triangle, side of the triangle, I guess there's something to mention of what has been called one of the most significant events in open source AI or open source machine learning, and that's Llama 3.1. So for those who don't know, Llama is just a family of models that essentially were created by Meta, the holding company for Facebook. And unlike ChatGPT, OpenAI, who've built ChatGPT, this is an open source model in the sense that the model weights and the model parameters are freely available for developers to view, to interrogate, but to also download and run locally, or at least certain versions of the model locally. But I think one of the things that really set it apart is the fact that it's the 40 billion version parameter, or rather the 405 billion parameter, I stand corrected, version of the model, which is really a behemoth model from a parameter size point of view. In other words, 405 billion parameters. That's currently, from a leaderboard perspective, really on par, if not beating GPT-4o on several benchmarks when it comes to human eval, coding, math, etc. Now, this is, of course, comparing it to the version of ChatGPT that we have currently, GPT-4o, that's around. There's no doubt that ChatGPT is likely to hit back, if not already hit back, with some of the existing releases, whether it's advanced voice mode or something in the a little bit of the rumors circling around Twitter with regard to GPT-5 under a code name, etc. But in summary, Llama 3.1, I think what's really important here is not that, okay, it's a great academic achievement, the fact that it's matching GPT-4o on some metrics. It's what's the implications of that for in business, people like us who want to build things with this. And I think it's through multiple lenses. I think one is the fact that you can run this model and have complete oversight over data in, data out if you're locally deploying it, right? So you can't locally deploy ChatGPT. Whenever you're interacting with ChatGPT, you're simply sending a API request to their servers, and then it's sending back the response. You can get a bit more nuance around hosting that in Azure or the cloud, which is what we do when we build things. But ultimately, there's only so much you can trust as far as the data going in and data going out. If you're dealing with extremely sensitive data, extremely confidential data, or just your risk tolerance isn't that high, there are many. Now we have an opportunity to actually have a self-contained local model through Llama 3.1, or rather a model that is small and self-contained, but more importantly is good enough to use. Before we've had small models like 8 billion parameter Mistral models that you could run locally, but on all the benchmarks, it never reached ChatGPT 4.0's sort of sophistication. So you essentially were confronted with, okay, I'm going to have to give away some of the accuracy away, or the robustness of the model itself in terms of how generalizable it is and being able to handle different tasks. You have to trade that away for something smaller that you can run locally that you have more control over. And now I think it's shifted a little bit where you can get very, very, very close to that ability of the current ChatGPT 4.0 model, but through all the benefits of a local deployment, etc. Now, of course, in our world, I mean, we deal with clients that maybe fall under that sort of classification of dealing with very, very private data, very confidential data. Our parent company as well. So that's in a summary, Llama 3.1. I'm not sure, Tim, if you have any thoughts on especially the business angle of what that might mean compared to building with closed source models, and especially from that data privacy angle, if you have any thoughts around that.
Look, I suppose, let me just take a step back before I get to answer that question. I think the trajectory that we're on, which is really interesting, is that the amount, Karl, you're talking about the amount of compute and the amount of data that you need to produce models that are actually useful in the world, and whether the usefulness of that comes out of the predictability of the replies, the reduction in hallucinations, whether you're using other agentic approaches to try to validate the outputs, whatever they might be. We're heading towards a world where the resources required to have these things at scale is so enormous that it just feels to me like it's incredibly unsustainable. And if we go back to the model, and let me tell you why I say that, like, when we started this AI race 2 years ago, there has been for a long time this idea that we're trying to replicate what the brain does. The brain is if we use the model that you have, Karl, an engine, a model, and a data, that's that fire model. The amount of energy that's required in the human brain to produce its simulation of the world, which is what it does really well. It simulates the world, makes predictions about what the world might be, 3D models in the future, in time, all of those things, is about 30 watts of power. Now, it feels to me like although we brute forcing our way towards something, and we're trying to, through the likes of the open source models, bring this technology to wider communities, the application in business and other things, it just feels to me like this is not going to be the approach that's going to win out. It can't be that we require the amount of energy of a small country to produce these things and then try to find ways to democratize them. So my mind goes to the fact that the breakthroughs that are going to come are going to be probably in the model design, and that the models that we're iterating upon at the moment, we know the seminal papers that were published, the idea of these pre-trained transformers, something's going to change in the architecture, which means it will require far less compute, which is really where we're trying to go as we bring these things into the business application. How do I build smaller models? How to make them more efficient? Josh, you were talking about that. How do I route some of the queries to more optimized parts of the model architecture? And then I think the second part is data. I think that we are on the wrong path with data as well. And let's see how these predictions are making in our age. But when you actually look at the data that's on the internet that these models have been trained on, there's an incredible amount of duplication. You don't need to be an expert to see how much of the news around the world gets recirculated through different publications. The actual sort of source data that isn't duplicate and that is high in veracity is quite limited. It feels like there's a lot of data out there, but if you deduplicate what's been repurposed on different angles of the political sides of the political spectrum or for different publications, the unique data that represents the world is quite small, and that introduces the requirement for creating things like synthetic data. And where I think that's going to go is that I think that multimodal ways of collecting data are going to be the breakthrough. So XAI is talking a lot about how they're going to use Grok. I mean, I think they've just trained Grok 2, and they're going to release Grok 3 at the end of this year. But the real thing that's happening there is going to be Optimus, and Optimus being able to engage with the real world and pick up information about the way physics works in the world in a way. Visual input data comes through, which is novel, real world, first-hand data. So if you think about an Optimus robot recording, picking up a jug of water and looking at how that water moves, there's no need for things like synthetic data where you've got first-hand models of what's really going on in the universe there. So I think that I want to answer your question in a very obtuse way, Josh, but I think I think that the answer for delivering real world value to organizations isn't going to come through further brute force or refining of the existing models we have. I think what's going to happen is there'll be a breakthrough in the models, which will allow them to become far more efficient in their architecture. And the way that some of that will be unlocked is by saying that we need to start to train these models on different types of data, not just the written regurgitation of what's out there in the internet, but more multimodal input sources. So look, I mean, I think if we go back to Llama 3, I think it's great that these things are becoming available. I think for now it closes the gap a little bit. I mean, there's always been this concern about the moats, the big tech getting all of the benefits, and I suppose it helps us with that a little bit. I think the privacy concerns will be addressed very largely by some of the on-device stuff, the smaller models, the chipsets that are coming out now for on-device. But I feel very much like we heading towards a sea of sameness in the evolution of all of this, and that this isn't where the big breakthroughs are going to come from in the next little while.
Interesting, and I think you mentioned something there in terms of synthetic data, and I think that is quite interesting because what we've seen is these evolution of what they call SLMs, or small language models, that essentially. So if I can take a step back, you have these large language models that obviously called large because they're very large from a model size, a parameter point of view, and it takes vast amounts of storage and memory to hold and run these weights on a typical compute device, which is why they have these massive data warehouses. One way to try and get these models smaller is to something that called quantization. So they quantize the weights of the model, which simply means to store it at a lower floating point, but less floating points, which leads to less precision in the models, but slightly less precision in the model weights, because you then have you're storing whatever the weight is with less precision, less floating point numbers. But that means that you have a lower footprint on memory, so it can then reduce the model size. So that's the one way they've been doing it. But taking a step further to create these small language models, they've introduced things like knowledge distillation as well, which is basically having like some models like Gamma and Pi, and I stand to be corrected, but I believe either one of those two are trained completely on synthetic data, in the sense of all the data it's been trained on is being produced by what they call a teacher model, or a much more stronger model. So the parent model, if it's GPT or it's Llama, creates these answer value pairs, and it's those synthetic data, the creation of these models, that are fed as input to these smaller models to create this sort of knowledge distillation, which is interesting. And again, I think there's a question that opens up, and how sustainable is that in itself, because we've seen articles come or individuals talking in the industry about what they call model collapse, or I think there's another name for it, MAD model. I think Karl can help me with the full acronym there. But yeah, the basic trend is that by continuously training these small language models on synthetic data, you end up with a feedback loop where the model degrades in its ability, generalizability, and sophistication, etc. The one point I want to make about the energy requirement and whether that's really sustainable or not, I think 100% agree it's not sustainable, but I wonder until what point how far do the current players want to take this approach? In other words, I don't think they've seen the wall yet in terms of model parameter size. It might sound like 405 billion parameters is massive, and I think they themselves know that it's not that they're going to have to think about an alternate model design, because just going brute force bigger and bigger is not sustainable. But where's that inflection point? Where I don't think we've reached that point where I think a billion parameter model might just be incredibly powerful to open up incredible automation opportunities and other such opportunities to deliver value. It may not be as groundbreaking to deliver AGI or things like that nature, but I think
I think the big question is, what are the gains that will come? So, I mean, the model autophagy disorder, bad or whatever it is already an admittance that there's data scarcity. There's a problem with enough real-world data on the way that these models have been trained that we need to synthesize data. So if you add more parameters through synthetic data, all you're going to get is a lower fidelity rendering of the universe that's faster. Now, that's going to be, I think that's got all the inherent flaws that LLMs have. But surely, I suppose my question is, if we haven't hit the wall and you could conceive of a 4 trillion parameter model based on the real world data we have plus synthetic data that we're generating, what do we anticipate those models doing that the current ones don't do?
I mean, is the investment in large language models really, if you look at what's the outcome, because is it to try to solve multiple use cases? Because I think if you look at LLMs, they're pretty generic at this point. I mean, you can do many things with them, and perhaps this is where there might be a divergence, right? In one way, OpenAI and a few others are talking about artificial general intelligence, AGI, and you need very, very big models to essentially look at the world like a human brain, right? To be able to process many different things. I would assume that, I think the move maybe, or the ability for businesses and others to kind of use SLM, so small language models, is really about saying, well, rather than having one big model that does everything, you have very specific use cases, very specific models, and you get rid of maybe the energy requirements, maybe the processing requirements, and also maybe the data requirements. You make it much more specific, and there's maybe a lot more value in a smaller model that can do something very well, and maybe having hundreds of these or thousands of these available to you to solve different tasks. And really, it's just about stringing them together rather than using one big model. Is that maybe a different way to look at it?
I think that the path that we're going on with the constant evolution of LLMs doesn't take us anywhere profoundly different. Like, that's the point I'm trying to make. But I think that an LLM as an orchestrator of a toolkit is very powerful, which is what you're saying, Karl. So if you look at what OpenAI has just released quite recently, I think Josh, I bounced this idea off you. They've released a JSON upgrade now, which is fully deterministic. So rather than using the probabilistic model that OpenAI has used on the past, it said, now here, when I ask you in natural language to pass a JSON output, I'm no longer going to want you to act like an LLM and give me some probabilistic interpretation of what the JSON might look like, because that doesn't work. That's not going to scale at an industrial level, because every now and again, the LLM is going to put a square brace instead of a curly brace, because probabilistically that might just happen, which is going to break your code. So what it does in that instance is it diverts out of its normal architecture and says, here's another small model, which is going to constrain what the outputs are going to be and just render correctly structured JSON, which helps a big problem with building out applications using LLMs. Early on, I thought they were doing something like this with Wolfram Alpha. I don't know if you remember when they first released the first version of GPT, you could trick it by saying, what's 1 + 1? And it would say 2, and you'd say, no, it's not, it's 3. And it would say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, you're right, it's 3. Then obviously what they did is they built in some sort of way of arresting the output from running through the normal model. It was almost like it was accessing like a maths library or something. So I think what you're saying is right. I think that you want to start to understand the point services that you're trying to deliver, whether they're coding outcomes or whether they're perhaps classic pipes in automation or something, where you don't actually want this thing to be probabilistic anymore. You just want the LLM to orchestrate what tools to use and to grab, and then to use small models for point functions. So there could definitely be like an interesting evolution where, you use the LLM as the agent to decide what tools to use in a particular application, and then to break out of itself, execute in the tool, and then come back into the LLM to kind of do the next step. I don't know, Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I agree with your points. I think it's certainly possible. I still think that look, if you go back to the point of Llama and its compute, there's, I guess, what they claim, at least for Llama 3.1, is that it's compute optimal. So there was a paper that was released a little while ago that tried to calculate basically at what point do you get diminishing returns from just increasing model size and parameters in terms of benchmark accuracy on tasks like math, etc. And they found that it was like essentially a scaling law that basically said for every doubling of model size, the number of training tokens need to be also doubled. Otherwise, you end up with sort of diminished returns. And apparently, Llama 3.1 is sort of perfectly optimal in terms of the number of tokens and the training size, which can't be said for GPT-4 apparently, which is under trained from a compute optimal point of view.
Help us understand what that means, Josh. So you're saying whatever the laws are of the way the models work, okay, so there's going to be like inherent constraints to how well the models can perform. Llama 3 best matches compute. Is that what you're saying? So the more compute you throw, it will get you the best model performance per unit of compute that you throw at it compared to any other model. Yeah.
Yeah, the ratio of basically it's a ratio of compute and input data. So the number of tokens it's been trained on.
Okay. Okay. And you said that's linear, like it's it is as close to the theoretical limit as you can get.
Yeah, that's according to what they claim, at least, that it's as close to the limit that from a ratio point of view. And so I think that's quite an engineering feat, I guess, for them. But I think, look, I do largely agree, especially with your multimodal point of training AI. I think it's a point that Jan LeCun mentioned, that, I mean, if you look at how a child learns, it's not just through text, it's through image and video, and look at how much bandwidth there really is there. And I think if Elon Musk and others are of the same opinion, particularly. So I think the next breakthrough is likely to be of that nature. But I guess my ultimate point is that I think we've only scratched the surface around the utility of these sort of quantized LLMs or SLMs. I think there's going to be some interesting use cases that comes up with the current tech to help automation. But I think certainly for the next breakthrough, I think that limit is going to be something that we're going to be confronted with.
Well, I'm actually very keen, maybe just to bring us back. I mean, we're speaking a bit about the future of AI, and again, I think NVIDIA is a clear beneficiary of what's been going on, at least in terms of their stock price. It's now the third most valuable company in the world, and I think the interesting part that I'm thinking about is, if you had to look at the constraints we're talking about, whether it's energy constraints, data constraints, model constraints, and maybe even the applicability, the use cases, there seem to be constraints in all of these. And the hype cycle that we're in with AI, I'd love to get from you two gentlemen your views on where we are on this hype cycle, and maybe if you had to, this is not investment advice, but if you had to be backing somebody out there, who would you be backing other than NVIDIA and the chip makers, because we know that they are still building out and saying a lot of infrastructure. But where are we, do you think? And who would you be backing at the moment?
I think we're splattering around the top, and I think if you have a look at what happened, so in the almost collapse of the stock market that happened last Monday, there was certainly enough media to say we think this might be due to the AI bubble bursting. And yes, it did come down to potentially some stuff with Japanese interest rates being raised. So people had taken big positions on borrowing money for free and then betting it in markets where they could get a good return was probably the underlying culprit. It's still the public sentiment that perhaps these AI stocks is overheated, and that might have been what caused it, I think is enough smoke to tell you that there's a bit of a fire brewing here. And it does come back to the same things we're talking about. Ultimately, although these models are promising incredible efficiency, they aren't efficient right now, and they're very expensive. The GPU is a massively expensive piece of hardware, and the energy requirements to plug into it and the data scarcity, all of these things come together to say, the cost of buying AI or funding these AI businesses right now isn't realizing real world returns that make it not a bubble, moving into bubble territory. And for that reason, it also, unless we can start to find use cases, so all of this incredible, this incredible generation of wealth that we were going to unlock from AI, where is it, right? I mean, all we've seen is the tech evolving, but we're not really seeing the use cases come to bear for all the reasons we've spoken about in the past: corporate inertia, the difficulty to get businesses to adopt a new change, and really sexy technology looking for something to do with it. That spark they're talking about in the middle of the triangle, Karl, the use case. I don't think we found it yet. And I think for those reasons, I think we're getting into dangerous territory. That would be my guess. I think we're getting quite close to the top, and I think some of that is driven by the fact that although this has given us a promise of what the future of AI might look like, I think these aren't the models that are going to win, and I think these aren't the approaches. Although they look very human and they're passing the Turing test and stuff, I think it'll be something far more efficient, multimodal, that will really bring the price point down effectively. Something you can truly run on a 30-watt piece of hardware. So my guess is we get into the end of this first wave of the bubble. I don't know, Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with much of that. I think we are getting towards that, the first the wave of the hype cycle that we find ourselves in. I think the issue of use case is obviously an important one. That is, as in terms of Karl's analogy, the sort of spark. And I think it's differential across different industries. So, according to the McKinsey Quantum Black report, supply chain and HR are seeing some cost reductions and revenue generation from it, while in manufacturing, they've actually slowed down the projections for the use cases of AI because it doesn't seem to have as much of a return on investment in terms of being able to automate some key manufacturing processes, etc., versus more deterministic current RPA methods. So I think my opinion is that there is still value that's going to be unlocked with this technology. For me, it's similar to with machine learning in the early days of machine learning, where it was a new technology, new frameworks. And when I say early days of machine learning, it sounds like it's like 50 years ago, but it's actually 2000. I would say machine learning as a practice has been a statistical method since about the 80s and 90s, but it's only when in the 2000s and 2010s, rather, with a release of things like Keras and other open source neural network frameworks that allowed people to build sort of these models robustly. It's only, so I would say that's how old machine learning is as a sort of practice, a community. And some of the same issues I see, or same teething pains I see there, I'm seeing here in terms of evaluation. Again, how do you properly evaluate accuracy for such an unstructured, open-ended output? You know what I mean? It's not as simple as a binary output or a regression model. So now we've seen the research papers put forth new types of metrics, new ways of calculating it, evaluating RAG solutions, putting in pipelines, guardrails of that nature. And I still think that even with the existing sophistication of these models, when it has the opportunity to augment RPA solutions, augment existing models, etc., I think that there's certainly use cases, certainly value there. But it is a matter of finding those use cases, and it's sort of almost like the reverse happened. The technology exploded on the scene, and now everyone's struggling to find the use cases for it. And I mean, obviously, it depends on who you speak to. You speak to the design thinking purists, they will absolutely lose their mind if you tell them that's what we're doing here, right? Because for them, it's all about the use case first, etc. But I think, in reality, in my opinion, the solution space and the problem space are more intertwined than one would think. And I think the sort of horizon of what technology brings as a possibility can actually help us think about particular solutions, particular areas that can help automate and so forth. But to answer your question, Karl, in summary, I mean, I still think there's a lot of value that's already coming out of the current technology. It's just a matter of the evaluation metrics, the things like LLM ops, which is how do you operationalize, manage the costs, manage the accuracy, monitor these things, all challenges that machine learning is actually still kind of settling on now as of the last couple of years. I see AI doing the same. But in terms of who I would bank with personally, I think, and again, not investment advice, I think not that one can necessarily invest in this company, as far as I'm aware here. But Anthropic's Claude, I think, is the company Anthropic, and they've released their flagship Claude model, similar to how OpenAI has released ChatGPT. And a lot of people in the last few weeks and the last few months have been leaving OpenAI to join Anthropic, actually, especially people on the ethics and governance board of OpenAI. And I think it's just the design philosophies of the two, with Anthropic being more concerned about those guardrails, those sort of moving a bit slower, making sure that we establish what's needed from a governance point of view and guardrail point of view, and while OpenAI is more about making products, as productionizes technology even as it stands. So I would go with Anthropic as the some moments of that.
All right.
So can I throw one more prediction in here? I think that, you know, while you're asking for not investment advice, let me give you some more not investment advice. I think there's a rationalizing force here that we mustn't lose perspective of, and that is that no matter how sexy these techs are, and I hear what you're saying, Josh, the end of the day, if there's no revenue line downstream that funds all of the VC money that's going in, at some point people are going to pull the plug on it. That's just the reality. And right now, these models have been built, these businesses have been built on absolutely crazy forward multiples on the assumption that a revenue stream will be unlocked. That might happen. I don't see that happening in the way that we're currently building the models because of what we've spoken about, the inherent constraints. However, there is something else that's happening, which we've all noticed, which is that the convergence between search and LLMs is getting closer and closer. There is a huge pie to go and steal from Google. Okay, they own the advertising space through search, and there's a possibility here that the horse to back is the one that manages to find the convergence between large language models and taking a serious bite out of Google's monopoly on search, because that's a way that you could then inadvertently redirect funding to the continuing build out of these models. Much like Google has done over the years with building things like maps and all of these crazy things that they've done, which have just been funded by advertising revenue through search. So I wouldn't inherently back the business that we think is building the better models. I'd back the business that's managing to quickly find alternative revenue streams to fund this R&D, which doesn't yet know where it's going to find purchase. Because I think that's reality. We don't really know where these models are going to find proper purchase. Yes, and VC money is going to run out of patience. Like, I'm surprised it hasn't already. So I'm betting on the business that finds a way of taking a big chunk of revenue from Google as the winner.
And I mean, there are some, I don't say incumbents, or some players in that field already, of course. I mean, Perplexity is probably one of the longest running, Perplexity.ai, and I use it a lot for research, etc. Because unlike ChatGPT, which I think is a version of ChatGPT-4 which does scour the internet as of a recent release, but traditionally it's just giving you knowledge based on its inbuilt knowledge or what it's learned through data exposure, while Perplexity scours the internet first for web pages, deep searches through multiple sublinks, etc., then gives you a summary of that with proposed questions. And I mean, that's a good one. I think the whole idea of generative search optimization is going to become a thing. I stand to be corrected, so I don't want to go on. As I said, I don't want to tell people falsehoods, but I did hear that it's either Perplexity or a similar company that's essentially looking at a revenue stream where usually when you ask a question of these search/Gen AI services, it will suggest some follow-up questions at the bottom of it, and that's certainly what Perplexity.ai does. So after you ask it the question, maybe you ask it, what is Company X's capex expenditure in the last year or whatever. It'll go find the annual report, summarize it, bring it to you, but it'll also bring some suggested questions. And there were some rumblings online of giving companies the ability to pay for their sort of.
It's the end of truth.
Pay for something to put their website or their if it's related, of course. Okay, I mean, I wouldn't want to ask it about capex expenditure and then see an Oros ad or something like that being suggested, or Oros call to action. But I mean, there's new revenue opportunities that's not going to be coming out of
I guess that's already happened with the media wars on the left and right political spectrums in the US, depending on. I mean, indexing, of Google search. Sorry, Karl.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it sounds like it's a perfect time. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, if you can disrupt search, Google is under fire. We know that they are now, they've lost, or they lost the antitrust case, so they are deemed to have an illegal monopoly on search. So if an entrant was going to get serious, I mean, if they weren't already serious, now's the time to go for it. Maybe just speaking of regulation.
Karl, just on that point, super interesting for our listeners. I mean, one of the implications of that antitrust case might be that Google, I mean, it would be extreme, but Google might have to fragment its business into isolated, a search business, a whatever else they do, hosting business, blah, 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 where that cross-subsidy isn't as kind of muddied, which would level the playing fields massively, as you say.
I mean, they own something like 90% of the search market. So, I mean, that is a very dominant position. Actually, speaking of judges and regulations, I mean, Tim, you mentioned that there was something new happening in California. I mean, it may be interesting just to cover that quickly before we wrap up. But what is happening there?
So just our listeners, if we remember a few series ago, we spoke about, I think, sort of unanimously our disappointment with the legislation that come out of Europe around regulation of AI, and just a quick refresher there. A lot of the focus was around personally identifiable information, so not using things like social profiles to build credit models. And I think we all sort of looked at that and thought, is that as deep as we can go? Like, does that really make sense? So what's happened now is that in California, there's a bill that's been passed. It's got the catchy name Bill 1047. So you can Google it if you want to. But it really cuts a lot more deep. And I think what it's done, I think the fact that the signs that it's a serious piece of legislation have been the response out of Silicon Valley, who've almost unanimously said we don't want this. But really what this piece of legislation in California is looking to do is to say we need to regulate future models. So models where the training spend, the data, the amount of money that's been spent on training the models is in excess of $100 million. So we're actually talking about models now that have more floating points than any of the existing models. So this will be post XAI's Grok 3, it'll be post possibly GPT-5, but these future models we need to aim some legislation to control how they might look. And I think the three things that they're talking about is that they will actually want to strength test what these models could potentially do, simulate them. And the cases that they're talking about are attacks on public infrastructure. So could these models be used to go and attack electricity grids, things like that? Highly damaging cyber attacks they talk about, which could lead to mass casualty events. Again, we're going back to this idea of what would happen if you get a bad actor behind a really powerful model. Chemical, biological, radioactive, and nuclear weapons. We've spoken about that. These are the really scary things that somebody could potentially do. So they're really putting that in the crosshairs, which is really good. Second thing that they're talking about doing is establishing something called Karl Compute, and Karl Compute would be a public cloud. So we've identified the fact that the amount of money you required for this compute is just creating incredible moats. So I suppose a step forward towards democratizing the access to this to cloud compute. Inside that Karl Compute, people could run research into safe deployment and large-scale artificial intelligence models, and create some equality there. And then the third leg of this piece of legislation has been around whistleblower protection. And I think we've touched on it, a bit of an exodus from certain people leaving. There was a bit of a run out of OpenAI. Some people were very careful about what they said, I think really tied up in a lot of non-disclosure agreements and stuff. But, if you sit inside a business that's about to launch something profoundly disruptive, is something like a non-disclosure agreement really going to be enough? Should we not be creating frameworks that allow whistleblowers to sound the alarm if they feel they need to? So we'll see what happens. It's passed in California, but I think it needs to go a little bit further now to become something beyond just sort of a state piece of legislation. But I thought worth touching on.
That's very interesting. So you can see legislators are moving as fast as AI is moving, probably. We are, I think, going to wrap it up. I mean, thanks, gentlemen, for the discussion today. I think it's been a really good conversation. We've covered a lot of topics. The Olympics are done, and so are we for today. I just want to thank again, Tim, for joining us as a guest. Hope we can have you back again, Tim, and get some of your insights. And Josh, thanks for your expertise again. We hope that you'll tune in again sometime soon for our next podcast. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's been nice to be back.
Cheers. Bye-bye.